Welcome, and happy Tuesday, August 30th. Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. One of these days, I'll get the order of that introduction correct. But in the meantime, I'm your host, Q, coming to you yet again from my mother's basement, and I'm joined by my co-host, P. How goes it, P?
It goes fantastically, as always. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. I'm excited about our conversation today. Tell the people who we're talking to.
So we have Jin Urso, also known as Margot, joining us today from BPI, and we're going to be talking about how and why Bitcoin is for enemies. I urge you all, if you're familiar with Margot, with Jin, her work, some of her stances and beliefs, if this triggers an emotional reaction, I really urge you to listen closely, and I'm going to give this reminder right before we kick off the interview with her. But before we do that, we're going to kick things off with some news and notes. Let's dive into it. So, the SEC hates you and actively screws you over yet again. Roundhill Mean ETF is an ETF that launched on December 8th, 2021. It's currently traded on the New York Stock Exchange. It can be found on countless brokerages. Mind you, this was launched before the Bitcoin ETF, and they allow this one because they can always halt. They can always halt volatility if they're, the friends over at one of their big firms like Melvin Capital or Citadel gets messed up in a trade. Many of you are familiar with this move that they pulled last year during the whole meme stock craze. Keep in mind, like, this just happened a couple of weeks ago with Bed Bath & Beyond. It is worth noting that this isn't Gary Gensler's like, what, I am king of the castle. I am the stock market's daddy. No, like, as much as I love to dunk on the gay man, Gary Gensler, no, this is actually a very common practice in Wall Street, which further cements my claims that Wall Street is just a legalized casino designed to take your money away from you and make the powers that be richer. That's it. That's all it's for. I don't know why you would think otherwise. But either of you guys have anything to say about Devil Dick or Devil's husband, Gary Gensler?
Did you just say double-dicked Gary Gensler?
I tried to say Devil Dick, but I was like, wait a minute. No.
So I don't know if you know this, but humans obviously have, one penis and, one other reproductive hole, which will not be named because that'd be too much. Penis is okay. Anyway, the point is, marsupials have actually a two-pronged penis. So I think what you just claimed is that Gary Gensler is a marsupial.
Perhaps. But P, what's going on in the political space, and why don't?
Wait, sorry, Q. Are you rubbing your hands together?
There? Like, what are you doing?
Wait, you guys hear that every time I do that?
Yes.
So loudly. But we've never heard it before, though. I thought, like,
I literally do it every day.
Oh no, we can't. We couldn't hear it before.
It's like a twitch.
Maybe your microphone is weird. But anyway, I imagined you sort of like, doing like the evil.
Excellent.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's keep going.
Tell me about a politician that I'm not going to care about in 6 months.
Oh, how dare you besmirch the good name of Monsieur Bruce Fenton. Bruce Fenton is a Bitcoiner who is running for office. He proposed a policy paper on CBDCs, which Chris is sharing in tiny font. Chris, can you make that huge? Yeah, there we go. He proposed a policy paper on CBDCs, central bank controlled digital currencies, and he is currently running for senator of New Hampshire. There's not much to tell here. You can read it. It's very funny, and it makes me happy that the entire response is just the word no, which I think is appropriate. CBDCs are designed primarily to allow governments to surveil their citizens. We've seen this huge push with COVID to move us closer and closer to a cashless society. And of course, the reason that is desired by decentralized financial entities is because in a cashless society, you can much more easily track everyone's usage of money. And that is something that is not prior to the current situation we're in. Cash was sort of like always, you could always use cash, but you can't do that anymore. And we need to push back on that. Q, Chris, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I love the fact that he's just like, no. To be honest, though, this is like one of those like more gimmicky things, which is a red flag to me personally. Because when a politician just wants to do like a quick little gimmick to get in front of your screen on a social media app, because the algorithm realizes like, oh, he's talking about Bitcoin. Okay, sorry, Chris.
No more hand wringing.
Dude, this is bad. All right, I'll figure out what to do with my hands, I guess. But um, the truth is, this is just going to get ignored, which is what's a little frustrating. However, oh my God. Thank you so much, Sovereign Pickle, for calling me out. That's why you guys could hear that.
Yeah, you sound way better now.
I was not connected to this microphone. That's on.
You garbage person.
I'm an idiot. All right. My bad. I can go back to rubbing my hands now. Yay. um, everything is frozen, so I hope this is working. But we're going to have Natalie Smolensky on the show hopefully soon. And Natalie has taken it upon herself to actually write a real CBDC white paper. It's about 40 pages long. I had the pleasure of reading it, and it is truly excellent. Its messaging is exactly this, like it says no, but explains why we're saying no. And I think that will be far better received by the politicians in DC. So this is a really cool gimmick, but that's really to me all it reads as to be honest, I don't think Tom Fenton's gonna win or be a relevant politician.
His name is Bruce.
Bruce.
Just Bruce Fenton.
That's how little I care about Bruce Fenton.
Wait. I would rather have Bruce Fenton as a senator. I think it would be awesome if we were able to get him as a senator for New Hampshire. He's an awesome dude. But I do hear your point. I also think that it is hilarious that you're besmirching people who use memes and hilarity to communicate. Because let's be real, that's all we do all day long.
No, you're right. You're right that I'm being super. Am I still frozen?
Yes, you are. But it's incredible because you look like this.
But I'm like, my voice is still coming through, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Incredible. We're gonna let this keep ripping for a while.
Also, you're. By the way, you're seeing how the sausage is made, my friends. We grind it up, we mix in the insect meat, and then we squeeze it out into sausages and put it in little casings. Q, your internet is garbage right now, according to the feed.
Which I don't understand why, but is my voice?
I blame the broken political system that we live in today.
Okay, let me just continue to hammer the point that I've made for months now, that I will continue to make for months. This reads as though all he's doing is trying to like go towards the Bitcoin vote.
Yeah, no. Yes, except he's a hardcore Bitcoiner. So it's more like he's like, yo, let me shit on the existing political system by being funny and using a meme. This is like, Jimmy Song, friend of the show. I don't know why I find that phrase so amusing, but good old friend of the show, Jimmy Song, and a couple other people got together and made a big book that you can buy on Amazon right now. That's I think it's called Reasons to Invest in Altcoins. And you can buy the book. I think it's $17, and you open it up, and every single page is blank. I think that's funny. I think it deserves to be on everyone's bookshelf in America.
It's got like a 3 stars because the ratings are either 5 or 1s. People are like, I can't believe I paid all this money for this book, or it's this is the greatest book I've ever read. So it's very, very funny.
Yeah. I'm going to increase the resolution of Q's image because it is hilarious to me. So those who are watching, you get to see Q's frozen face as Chris and I continue to take us into the future.
Yeah, no, I think I'll just hammer home the last little point with the CBDCs and forcing like a cashless society. I know that right now, like a lot of places, or I'm seeing by me, there are places that are no longer allowing cash to be used. So we brought Q back. Maybe.
Nope.
It looks like there's many places that have they can only accept credit card, which is very interesting because then you're at the whims of the credit card companies, and if your credit card doesn't work, I can't even talk. Q is so distracting.
I'm not even doing anything. I'm just trying to figure this out.
Yeah, your internet's garbage, my friend. In the meantime, viewers, you can admire my hideous mustache, which has gotten slightly shorter. We'll see how short I get before I start screaming racial epithets and making references to the Third Reich. Going forward, we'll just leave Q in no camera mode. Chris,
Yeah, I got the next story then.
hit it.
So eBay has begun locking down accounts of users that have sold over $600 worth of products until they submit their social security number for IRS
Fucking
reporting.
people.
It is. The ruling, as of January 2022, the IRS will now require all annual online sales over $600 to be reported using Form 1099-K. I know the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that in previously that she would love to track all purchases of $600, whether it was cash, credit card, whatever. That ruling, I think, was struck down, but they have still pushed forward legislation, like I said, in January of 2022, that the IRS wants for all online reporting for $600 or more. The requirement previously only applied to sellers that with at least 200 transactions or over 20,000 in sales each year. So I mean, like just the delta on that alone is like crazy. 200 sales versus and 20,000 is much bigger. And Pete, you can talk about this because you've been around forever. Obviously, the dollar has been devaluing in your over 100 years of life. And through your wisdom, back at McDonald's, you used to get a burger for a nickel or whatever it may be. And now you've seen inflation in those prices that, what's a Big Mac go for nowadays? $6, $7, something like that at least. So isn't it very interesting that they keep bringing the limits down while also devaluing your dollar? So like you hit those limits much, much faster. I mean, even $600 alone, I know when they wanted to track all transactions, I'm referring to the ruling that Janet Yellen wanted to include. I mean, most people, let's be honest, the majority of people's rents and or mortgages is more than $600. So imagine like having to report to the IRS like your mortgage payments. I know that normally comes into a factor when you're reporting anyway, but they wanted to like know specifically like what the transaction was and what it is going to, which is just crazy. This change will impact your 2022 sales and your 2023 tax filings. So coming up this April 15th of 2023, when you file your taxes, it'll apply for that. It will not be applied to your 2021 sales and your 2022 1099-K forms. So for the previous year's thing. But going forward, this is what the reporting requirements are.
Yeah, this is so fucked up. Obviously, as you mentioned, the dollar has been devalued profoundly. You used to be able to buy like an entire house kit from Sears for like $5,000. That's a whole other story. But the fact that even as the dollar is being devalued, that they are continuing to reduce the amount of the reporting requirements, the dollar amount, is insulting to say the least. Again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is financial surveillance. This country was originally founded on a number of things, and there was a sort of, in a sense, as many of you know, of the government should be smaller and should be prevented from overreaching. And I just feel like the financial aspect of the current government overreach is just one tiny piece of this larger problem that we're facing right now. But to limit the reporting requirements to $600 is just absolutely insane. Chris, remind me, does this also include the reporting requirements associated with like collecting social security numbers from people? So this is the situation where if I sell you a table saw for $601, am I required to collect your social security number?
So I will caveat this by saying I'm not a tax professional and this is not legal advice. Technically, if that transaction were to occur and we were doing cash, we are supposed to report that. But in theory, right now, no, that is not passed. So that was
that's a different
one of Janet Yellen's implementations that she wanted $600 for all payments. Technically, by law, you're supposed to do that, but not tax advice.
Got it.
Not
Also, to be clear, pay your taxes, my friends. Do not get on the wrong side of the tax man. That is a bad strategy. Let's keep going. I have no idea where Q is. He was abducted by aliens, got fed into a meat grinder. Who knows? But we're going to keep going without him. So Iran has announced, or in a sort of roundabout way, that they will. Oh, Q, you're back. You rejoined.
Does this work?
It does work.
Oh, thank God. This is way too stressful. Please continue.
No.
Well, it's actually your story.
We're talking about Iran.
Oh my God. Okay, where are we in this story?
Just the very beginning.
Just the very beginning.
Okay, then I'm just gonna start it over if I may, because this took.
There's nothing to start over. This is the beginning of the story. Please.
All right.
Take us away.
So, as the title would suggest, Bitcoin is for enemies. It was announced yesterday. Speaking to a reporter. Okay, I'm just going to read this because honestly, I laughed a few times and had to read and have this translated to me from Farsi into English by multiple people because I thought I read it wrong. But speaking to reporters at the conclusion of an exhibition of automotive industry in Tehran on Sunday, Fatemi Amin said that comprehensive and detailed law ratified by the administration defines regulations on cryptocurrencies, the supply of fuel and electricity for mining, and the authorization to use cryptocurrencies. Under an agreement between the Ministry of Industry and the Central Bank of Iran, the imports from abroad can be processed with the use of cryptocurrencies. They never specify anything in particular. I think this is a huge step forward for Bitcoin as a whole. We'll dive into sort of why I think they're hedging themselves and not necessarily naming Bitcoin as itself. But this is now another example of a country out there that is using Bitcoin and the broader cryptocurrency market to navigate and get around the US sanctions. And Russia took a similar stance shortly after the US announced sanctions on them. And Putin said, please feel free to pay us in rubles, pay us in gold, or pay us in Bitcoin. And now you have Iran following a similar path. So I think it's very, very interesting as these countries that the US has said, don't trade with them. Well, guess what? They have what the rest of the world needs. Iran has such an excess amount of oil that the country subsidizes its own electricity for its citizens, which, fun fact, makes Bitcoin mining very, very lucrative in that country. However, Iran actually last year sent out a ban on Bitcoin mining for no reason other than the fact that it was starting to use up too much energy on their energy grids. And there were rolling blackouts that Iran was dealing with all of last summer. So it's interesting that on a global stage, you have a country like Iran and Russia both coming out and saying, we will accept Bitcoin, we will accept cryptocurrencies for trades. And then internally, they are not willing to allow their citizens to have that same freedom. You have Iran passing these bans and restrictions on Bitcoin mining. You have the news out of Russia saying that they are not going to allow citizens to transact goods and services in exchange for Bitcoin, crypto, or NFTs. You have the country of Ukraine openly accepting Bitcoin donations while at the same time telling their citizens, hey, there's only a limit to how much Bitcoin you yourself can have and hold and buy per day. So this is the beginning of something very, very interesting to me. And I open it up to either of you because like I have a very strong bias in this matter. I, however, believe that this is the right step towards Bitcoin being adopted en masse by countries.
Yeah, I mean, Q, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Iran like number 3 or 4 in Bitcoin mining in the world? I know they've had a little bit of a hiccup with banning it or restricting it, but I believe it's US, China, Kazakhstan, maybe, and then Iran's either 3 or 4 fighting in between there.
It depending on the list you look at, it is right after Kazakhstan, and the main reason issue why is the same reason and issue, quite frankly, that like you don't get the right readings and numbers out of China. A lot of VPNs are being used. A lot of mining sort of pools are hidden and tucked away. Here's a really, really interesting thing that I learned about Bitcoin mining in Iran. So 2 places where electricity is free: school systems and churches. So what did Bitcoin miners go do? They went to the basements of schools and churches and set up Bitcoin mining rigs because the electricity there is free. Love that. Absolutely love that. So it is a very important part of the broader global Bitcoin mining ecosystem. And I urge people who hear this news and then scoff and be like, well, there you go. Like Bitcoin is being used by Russia. Bitcoin's being used by Iran. Like, why would we in the US use Bitcoin? Bitcoin is for everyone, but we have to really understand the reasons why they're actually being forced to use Bitcoin. And when we realize like, oh, it's because the US is yet again overplaying their hands and trying to sort of play this de facto, like, hey, our rules are the rules you have to play by too, when in reality, like, people just need oil, people need gas, people need energy. We are entering winter, and you have two countries in Iran and Russia that have a significant portion of global energy reserves and are now under US sanctions for what? Why is Iran actually under US sanctions? Really ask yourself that. And if you cite Western media sources like I NGMI, um, ah, Venezuela as well. Chris, you know this part of the story better. Do you want to connect those dots in Venezuela? Another example of a country that to the West is an enemy and yet has the opportunity to use Bitcoin and grow as a result.
Yeah, no, Adam O, friend of the show. That rhymes really well. That was clean. He was basically saying, like, imagine a scenario where Iran is actively evading sanctions by allowing trade partners to pay in Bitcoin, which is true. Venezuela has a large, probably the second largest oil reserves outside of Saudi Arabia in terms of oil reserves that the country holds. So very energy dense and rich nation can mine Bitcoin with their energy resources because they're also under sanctions from the United States. Trade Bitcoin with Iran, and then Iran could basically send them goods and services in return. And basically, they never have to touch the US dollar. Obviously, this is a way that people say, like, the death of the petrodollar, or, this does not bode well for the expansion of the US dollar globally. So, I know the US dollar is strengthening right now, or it appears that way, comparing the basket of goods on the DXY. But this is bad for the dollar long term if this starts happening. And then people start realizing, wait, why do I have to pay in US dollars when the US can print it infinitum? And when we can when this is hurting our economy, and we can use something that everyone can use, and no one gets to be the ruler or rulers over. So yeah, I think that's a cool thing. It remains to be seen if this is going to happen or not, but I think it'd be very, very interesting for sure. Pete, anything else to add? Also known as Chris Alamo.
No, I think you guys nailed it.
There's I want to pull up Winsome Hax's comment because I think it's really, really interesting that you're seeing these countries on external facing and global facing deals saying, hey, we will accept this trustless form of money. I don't trust your currency. You can trust ours, or if you opt not to, there's this alternative that we will look to and we will accept. But then internally, they still hope to have this control over their citizens and using and banning certain things like Bitcoin and broader cryptocurrencies. This has all the markings to me of a CBDC getting rolled out in a lot of these jurisdictions. So something to be cautious of, something to be aware of. I can't stop laughing at Chris's crush in the chat. Everyone should do themselves a favor. Go over to YouTube right now and just read the chat box because Chris has a new fan. I love this for you, Chris.
I'm a lover, not a fighter.
Any final thoughts on Bitcoin is for enemies? We're literally seeing in real time the enemies that the US government has said are enemies of the US state are now using Bitcoin. That was not a zoom in on my face.
I thought you were going to say something profound. So
no, I asked you. I was like, do you guys have any more thoughts?
I mean, look, like I say this a lot. The thing that is most compelling to me about Bitcoin is the incentive structures that it creates and that it supports. And one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin is that it is a system where, in many cases, serving your own interests is actually serving the interests of the larger network. And Bitcoin was implemented in such a way that it disintermediates financial transactions and it removes or makes it very, very difficult for a lot of the censorship and government overreach that is becoming all too common. So I think that to the name of this episode and to everything that you're saying, Q, I think people need to become comfortable with the idea that this is a tool that is removed from should be removed from the larger political and economic war zone that we are currently living in, and it persists despite and outside of that, and that is not a bad thing, as I think a lot of the political narratives would have you believe. That is a fantastic thing, and we should all support that aspect of Bitcoin rather than try to create systems around it that control that aspect of it. Those are my thoughts.
Well said.
I think we should remind it.
No, just do it.
All right.
Let's see if you can do it right.
My friends, Bitcoin Amsterdam is coming up. You should all go. It is going to be incredible. It is in an incredible city. There's incredible speakers. Incredible people will be there. If you use code BMLive, you will save 10% on your ticket. Also, the censorship-resistant issue of Bitcoin Magazine, which is out now in physical hard copy, is fantastic, and you should definitely check that out as well. It is relevant to this conversation we are having today. Don't miss out. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, and then we will be back with Margot, who is amazing, and we'll be talking about the progressive side of Bitcoin. Let's hit it.
What is up, guys? Thank you for sticking through those commercial breaks. I'm very excited to introduce our guest today, but before I do that, I hope anyone who is watching this live, as well as those who are listening later, both on YouTube, Rumble, on our podcast channels, however you are consuming this content, for I know a good vast majority of the vocal Bitcoiners, some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to be triggering. They're going to make you uncomfortable. You're not going to agree with a lot of things that come out of my mouth today because most of you already don't to begin with. I urge you to listen. I urge you to ask yourself questions like, why do I feel this way when someone says these things? So that we can grow, we can get better. And now, without further ado, I'm very, very excited and pleased to introduce our guest today. On Twitter, she goes by Jen Urso. Margot, I'm only going to say Margot unless you want to introduce your last name to the equation. She is a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, as well as a physicist and climate change scientist. I'm missing so many more things that you have accomplished and do. Welcome to the show, Margot.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, you got it mostly right. Yeah, I'm a physicist. I work on climate change stuff. I have a climate model that I'm working on for my PhD research. And yeah, I'm a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute and very interested in Bitcoin mining at the intersection of energy and the environment. And somehow, so now known for my political views, I guess, and philosophy. So yeah, here I am. Thank you.
Welcome to the show.
I feel you on that, being known for my political philosophy and defined as such despite it. P, I want to let you kick us off here, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, what went through my head just now was Q, weed is not a personality trait, but No, I mean, so Margot, we've had a couple conversations. Obviously, you were a speaker at Bitcoin 2022. I'd like to start by kind of defining the term progressive or progressivism and contrasting that with kind of the alternative side of the spectrum. And then going from there and kind of talking about why you feel like or why it is the case that people don't tend to associate progressivism with Bitcoin directly. So let's start with what is progressivism? What is the other side of the spectrum? And let's go from there.
Yeah, so historically, progressivism in the United States in particular, it has a varying narrative, you could say. It was something in the 1800s, early 1900s, that was a little bit different from how it's defined now. And I would say that the definition now is really thanks largely to Bernie Sanders and Barbara Lee, who were the original founders of the Progressive Congressional Caucus in the US House of Representatives. So their platform really was about free public education, universal health care for everybody, housing is a human right, education is a human right, a living wage is a human right, and all of this really kind of stems out of the FDR idea of an economic Bill of Rights, which was something that he was pushing towards the end of his life and in his fourth term as president of the United States. So this is really the fundamental basis of progressivism in the United States. It's also very much an umbrella term in which a lot of people from varying political philosophies have found themselves in coalition with each other around these basic fundamental ideas. So that's really what progressivism is today in the United States. And effectively, I think the reason why it has become such a popular term, and also internationally now as well, because there is something called Progressive International, which is headed by Yanis Varoufakis, and he is a well-known socialist or democratic socialist. And so really it is like a friendlier term for democratic socialism or social democracy, which is something that Europeans are fairly well familiar with. So that's really all that progressivism is. But as I said, it's an umbrella term. So you don't necessarily have like strict socialists who identify as progressives either, and you also don't necessarily have like hardcore statists who fall into that group either. So part of that is just because the United States is a two-party system and you kind of have to find a place for yourself, and the Democratic Party historically has been a place for these particular groups of people to squeeze into the political system, although it's still a challenge in terms of the electoral politics side of it. So really that's just all that progressivism is in the United States.
Got it. Okay. And why do you feel like where do you feel like the disconnect occurs between people that, or why do you think it is that people that are Bitcoiners tend to view progressivism and belief in Bitcoin as two opposing ideologies?
Hang on, could you repeat that question again? I'm just trying to
absolutely.
fix my video. Sorry.
Yeah, for sure. The question was, why do you feel like people tend to view progressivism and Bitcoin as opposing ideologies or ideologies that don't traditionally align?
Yeah, I think that there's two perspectives on that. One is actually from within the progressive or left view, and it's mostly because there's a misunderstanding of what Bitcoin is. And so people generally see Bitcoin as a speculative tool for rich people and Wall Street people, big investors to just trade and make money off of. and for them, that's a big turnoff because they're not interested in Wall Street. They're opposed to Wall Street. They remember the financial crisis. So that they just see it as tulip mania. And I've been told that it's just tulip mania many, many times. So that, and then also all of the FUD around the energy use and the environmental impact of Bitcoin really turns off a lot of people, a lot of progressives who actually would benefit from using Bitcoin, or who really appreciate the good things that are happening, especially in the global south, around Bitcoin adoption. So from that perspective, that's one perspective. And then the other side, people think that progressivism and Bitcoin are opposed because they only see one aspect of actually existing socialism in the media, and that's pretty much the USSR and Stalinism and what happened with Maoism in China. But you have to understand that that was something called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it was really taking over the state apparatus. And there were incredible critiques on the left, especially from anarchists who were also anti-capitalist socialists, who said, if you do it this way, you're just going to end up reproducing the existing system or ending up in totalitarianism, which is what happened. So the left in general, and socialists and people who call themselves democratic socialists, which is very popular nowadays thanks to Bernie Sanders, are actually not in favor of that kind of system. So what they're more interested in is a democratic form of governance, not just on the social aspect, but also in the market. So they're not necessarily opposed to markets either. But there are varying opinions and philosophies, and there certainly are tankies still, and there's Marxist Leninists who would love to see this dictatorship of proletariat come about, but there are also fascists and authoritarians as well. So it's just a spectrum of people who think that that's the way the world should operate. So that's why I think there's this other group that is opposed to it, because they really only see one example, which from a lot of left perspective was a failure in an attempt to bring about socialism.
Interesting.
I kind of want to
and there's there's a good quote from somebody, Malatesta, who was a Italian anarchist actually, and I tweeted it out yesterday, and it's just to give you an example of the critiques that happened at that time during when all happened. So Malatesta wrote, communism would be the most detestable tyranny that the human mind could conceive. Free and voluntary communism is ironical if one has not the right to live in a different regime, collectivist, mutualist, individualist. So this is somebody who was really a socialist and a revolutionary anarchist who was anti-capitalist saying this. So that's just to give you an example of a very prominent voice on the left from the early 20th, late 19th century, who was critiquing basically what ended up having in the USSR and in China.
I want to discuss this like candidly, like what I'm seeing in the chat, and it goes back to the question or the comment you made about how there is a full spectrum of these political ideologies, and yet we tend to, because we have grown up in this two-party system, it's so much easier for us to just, well, if you check these boxes, therefore you are left, and now being left equals being socialist, and being right equals fascist, and we continue to polarize ourselves further and further away. I want to separate progressivism from socialism, because I do believe these are two very different, very fundamentally different political ideologies that unfortunately have been confused by a lot of media outlets who are just like really good at tricking you into thinking that just because we want certain things like so I'm going to quote a very famous piece of paper. I'm going to take a little bit of liberty at the beginning, but in America,
Is the
Shut
piece
up.
of paper
Shut
famous?
up. Shut up. Very famous. Like if you don't know this line, P, you're fired. In America, not part of the quote, there are inalienable rights, such as the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to pursuit of happiness. And it's the first one for me where there are so many little things in this country where you don't actually have the right to life. And
How so?
I hate so, and I'm going to play both sides of this because this is like a personal dilemma of my own. I hate our healthcare system. I despise it. I loathe it. I think it is deplorable. At the same time, I do recognize the faults in a socialized healthcare system. I realize some of the medical breakthroughs that we are afforded in this country because it is a capitalist intensive system has allowed for certain medical breakthroughs that otherwise may not have been discovered in different incentive structures. I, however, also challenge the fact that in a capitalist system, solving or curing diseases is not as lucrative as simply doing something like, here's your treatment for your disease. So there are conflicting incentive structures where something like healthcare, which to me literally equals life, and the fact that it is for some people in certain situations, they can't afford an ambulance ride to the hospital. And there was a trend before COVID of people who would, instead of calling an ambulance to go to the hospital, they would call a freaking Uber because it was so much cheaper. That's my mini rant. I wanted to like stir the pot up a lot with this now. Between the three of us, we should solve the global healthcare system now that I've presented it in this way. So, P, I will start with you. What is your solution to the global healthcare system?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. It begins with small scale nuclear reactors. We need a nuclear reactor in every home. Once we have reliable energy, no, obviously I'm kidding. I will say I certainly don't identify as a progressive. And I think that a lot of the ideology behind it feels at first glance kind of anathema to the way that I kind of approach the world. However, we had this interesting conversation with Pete Risotto yesterday, rather. We had this conversation with him tomorrow. No, we had it yesterday. About the importance of having these types of discussions. And so I'm mostly really curious. I kind of want to learn from you, Margot, and also from you, Q, because I know that you identify more strongly with kind of Margot's side of the conversation. So I'm really here to learn from both of you and to sort of have a conversation, but I don't have a specific solution to the healthcare issue.
Yeah, it's a complicated one. It's complicated. It's not easy. I will say though that Cuba faced incredible embargoes around from the 1960s on because of their association with the Soviet Union, and they had to really develop their own healthcare system. And it is really one of the best healthcare systems for a country of that size. And they do prioritize preventive healthcare and community clinics. And I think that preventive healthcare is really, really important for solving the healthcare crisis. And I think that people on all sides can agree with that, especially with all of the controversy that happened with the vaccines and big pharma. And I know that people who identify as right and left both are not happy with big pharma and have not been for a very long time because of the prioritization of profits over people's health. And people have different conclusions as to why that is. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think it is also that these corporations, they hijack the state so that they can secure their oligopolies and their monopolies on the market. They also make it easier for them to push certain medications that are not necessarily necessary or that are actually helpful. They can speed those through. They can push, expedite the approval of these drugs, and it is all really for their own selfish end. So, and then on the other side, it's like, well, it'd be better if we just had an absolutely no profit healthcare system, right? So that would just be the easy solution. But But I think ultimately that it's not just that, it's really changing the philosophy of healthcare. And Mark Stephanie, I know he's written a book about this. I don't know if he's ever going to publish it. And he sent it to me and I read a little bit about it. He's the host of the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast. He's also a medical doctor. And so he talks a little bit about the things that he sees that are problems in the healthcare system. And like, for example, in Cuba, they're really big on preventive healthcare because it's just cheaper. If you're a little country, you're not rich like the United States, you're not going to be able to have all this medication and hospital care for your people, right? So you're going to focus on stopping people from getting sick. But in our system, it is not profitable to do that. And it's just easier to make money off of people who are perpetually sick for the rest of their lives. So, and I've seen this in Bitcoin and people who do not identify as progressives who point this very thing out, that it's much better to be preventative, to eat healthier, to take multivitamins or whatever it is that you think is the solution. So it's not an easy one, but I do think that if you decentralize the care, make it more collective, make it more community-based and absolutely preventative based off of how you eat, how you live, I think all of those would go a really long way. But this is just not the system that we live in today.
Interesting. I may have misheard you, but I think you were mentioning the kind of the idea that if you or maybe in our current system or maybe a privatized system as we have currently in the United States tends to provide opportunities for individual companies to basically maximize profits at the expense of health. Is that a fair characterization of one of the things you said?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to get a return on your investment. So, right. And then you always have to grow your business. That's part of the economic system that we live in, is eternal economic growth. So you're always having to push to, how do I extract more money? How do I, keep getting that profit for my shareholders? So in a healthcare system, right, you got to find a way to extract that money, or otherwise you're not really a profitable business.
Yeah, and I guess I'm wondering, I think of sort of in my head, if we try to centralize those systems or create a system where the government is fully supporting and funding all of those initiatives, that will, create environments that are just as bad in the sense that like people will take advantage of that. And so, again, I will acknowledge I am very, very novice when it comes to like these types of like the specifics of this type of conversation. But do you feel like in a more socialized healthcare system, you can effectively prevent those types of people from taking advantage of the fact that the government is stepping in? Do you feel like the government is in a position to be able to effectively manage those types of public goods?
Yeah, it's a complicated one. I think, first of all, today as it is, the government does fund a lot of the pharmaceutical research. So a lot like the recent coronavirus vaccine had been in development for like 10 years, or at least mRNAs have been, and that was really backstopped by the government funding, or really by your taxpayer money is funding that type of research. So it's already the investment in that is already largely coming from the government sector as it is. So that wouldn't change so much, really. And in Cuba, for example, I bring up Cuba because it's really the best example in terms of a country that identifies as a socialist or communist country and has been able to do healthcare fairly well. They came up with their own vaccine and got like 90% of their population vaccinated. Whether you agree with the method or not, I don't think it was an mRNA vaccine either. I think it was like a more traditional vaccine that they developed. So in that sense, they were able to innovate and create a vaccine without being necessarily a capitalist country. So I think there are ways in which you can do it. It is a very highly centralized government, and it does have its problems, and it does have its monetary issues. So it is not without problems, obviously. But in the United States, we do pay a lot of money for healthcare that really doesn't help us. We pay way more money than the other rich nations do. And in those countries, people get healthcare basically for free. They don't get a bill at the end of it. Even in China, actually, which is not really, ironically, not really socialized medicine, because I have lab mates at the university who are Chinese, and we had a conversation about this, and they said, when I go to the hospital in the U.S., I asked the doctor, how much is this going to cost? The doctor can't tell me, and I have no idea how much I'm going to be paying. But in China, they just tell them. The doctor's like, all right, this is going to cost $20. So there is like something definitely wrong here, and I don't. I'm gone off of off of answering your question, P, properly, but the system is really, really messed up in the US. It's just the world does not operate this way when it comes to healthcare. I think even just modest changes, whether it's the government fully taking over healthcare or just making some changes in terms of the domination of the market, might actually help us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I guess, and I think I want to hand it back to Q, but I just feel like I can't wrap my head around the idea that there is a solution that doesn't create more. Oh no, we lost. Oh, there you go.
Sorry, I don't know why my connection is not so good today.
No, it's fine. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the idea that there is this, that it is possible to create a centralized system that is run by sort of like a government entity that won't experience like a different type of problem. And I think what you're saying is like, well, if you look at other countries, there are examples where this can actually work.
I will actually challenge a little bit though in saying that, like, personally, I fall into the camp of, in this country, part of the thing that makes this country so beautiful compared to everywhere else in the world is we have the freedom of choice. The issue, however, is we do not have the freedom of choice when it comes to healthcare anymore. We do not have the freedom to say, oh, I need to go get this checkup, but you know what? There are restrictions based on what I can and can't ask at a doctor's office, what my insurance will and won't qualify for. I don't have that choice because also in this country, our healthcare is tied to our job. And so we will discuss the pay for this. What I candidly, and actually Jesse's comment, the can politicians learn? Let's pull that comment up on the stage or on the screen, because let's be honest here. It's going to come down to a split scenario where there's going to be some people who are more comfortable just letting the state have sort of that control and dictate and say like, hey, you know what? You can go, you do qualify to get this checkup or you don't, versus other people who are willing to pay a premium for other doctors. I do think one thing that I will always get stuck on, and I don't care what anyone else says, the incentives in the medical industry today are to charge as much as possible for as long as possible, as though it's a subscription service. Because, and say whatever you want about Obamacare, it created a backstop that is very, very dangerous. And you could actually see a trend of the average cost of people's healthcare drastically rose once Obamacare came into effect, because now there's a government backstop to say, well, if you can't pay for it, the government will foot your bill eventually down the line once I milk you for every last penny you got. So there is also this danger of this two setup system where, yes, you can have socialized healthcare, and if you choose to opt out and go privatized, you can do that. But you could end up falling under these very dangerous systems where you just get caught up in the overcharging of, well, this costs this much, this costs that much, and you know what? We have all these middlemen involved. Oh, and by the way, like, yeah, you know what? It will cost us maybe 2 times in R&D for a 10-year span to find the cure of this disease, or I can find something that will just sort of keep you coming back for more. I mean, we've seen time and time again, these pharmaceutical companies like have very hefty fines, have large, deep philosophical conversations around like the merits of, was this drug valid to be introduced? Why was this introduced? And we start to see the incentives are driven by money, not for health, not for the safety or betterment of humanity.
Yeah, it's
So
definitely it's bad incentives.
I'm not providing a solution. Like, I hate that. I think, Margot, you do an excellent job of, when you discuss certain issues, you bring up like viable, actionable solutions. And I put us in a conversation that I don't think any of us were going to necessarily win. And I'm candidly just trying to piss off as many people as possible, because I'm going to.
Oh yeah, you're doing well.
I mean, look, I'm going to say this every half hour on today's episode, but I get it. I get a lot of you don't agree with the conversation we're having today. I urge you to listen, ask any questions you want in the chat, but let's have a dialogue about this. I'm not here to change your mind, and you're not going to change my mind, but we're sharing this perspective because I think it's important, because this is a valid perspective of Bitcoiners, and it's a growing demographic of Bitcoiners, whether or not you agree with it. It is a growing demographic. So
yeah. And I think that's really important. I mean, we kind of talked about this yesterday with Rizzo, but it doesn't work in my mind to simply like shut down all types of conversation, especially when it involves Bitcoin, right? Like, if someone is coming into a conversation and they're willing to engage with it openly and honestly, and they're coming from their, a good actor, as I know you are, Margot, like, I think it's really important that we have these conversations. So I encourage everyone, I'd echo what you just said, Q.
Yeah, I would also say that maybe, like, if we got rid of insurance companies, healthcare might be cheaper. Maybe if we reined in the pharmaceutical companies, healthcare would be affordable. Because, like, Q kind of really hit it right when he's like, I don't have a choice. I only have a few insurance companies, and the companies tell me whether I deserve this treatment or not. And that's really not their right to say, because it really comes down to whether they want to pay for it or not. And of course, they don't want to pay for it. And I think, and that is fundamentally one of the big problems, is that these insurance companies, and really the insurance company, are just middlemen, rent seekers, and it's part of the financialization of the economy. That's what is called the FIRE sector. And they're basically like a rentier class in which we are indebted to them, and they decide whether we live or die. And that is fundamentally one of the biggest problems with the United States in general, in terms of our economic system. And to tie it all back to Bitcoin, right, is like, the idea is, let's get rid of these unproductive aspects of the economy. And I think we can agree that the insurance industry is fairly unproductive.
Totally. I mean, here's a fun little thing that, like, insurance, I talk about the 80-20 principle so much because it is law. It is law of life. And the 80-20 principle is applied to insurance companies. But I don't want to talk medical insurance for a second. I want to talk your car insurance, your house insurance, etc. 20% of users will actually be the policyholders that need the payments. They will get in the car.
Way less than that.
Fine, but it falls under this 80-20 principle, where the vast majority of people do not need it. Here is the issue when you introduce this mentality and framework into something like healthcare. I don't care how healthy you are. I don't care how often you go to the gym. If you've never put anything poisonous in your body, at a certain point, your body will deteriorate. Everyone's body does so. And unfortunately, that means everyone's body will require some sort of medical treatment. Yeah, but I'm not saying everyone's going to need surgery. I'm not saying everyone's going to have.
Well, but eventually they will. I mean, like,
exactly.
I mean, but I don't even think it doesn't have to be like an old age thing. Like, some percentage of people are going to get hit by cars, or fall down a hill. It's going to be through no fault of their own. But I think that. Go ahead, Q. I'll let it.
No. Like, you're finishing my point for me. So, but that is in essence, like, everyone will need healthcare.
Yeah, but I think the argument is to something that somebody said in the chat a second ago, or many minutes back. It's like, where does the cost for these services come from? And I think, and I may be misunderstanding what you guys are saying, but I think that kind of the worst of all worlds, my intuition here is that it's the situation we're currently in, where you sort of have this like socialized cost for some aspects of healthcare, or at least it's framed that way. But then there's also this like privatized cost. And so instead of being able to have actual competition in the market for healthcare, we have this this kind of like oligopoly where it's like there's the existing insurance companies and there's existing medical providers, and they basically decide, to your point, Margot, like what is the most financially viable for them, and it's completely removed in many cases from an actual competitive free market. Because if it was a free market, then you wouldn't have these like insane healthcare costs. And I think there's a lot of people who practice medical tourism for that reason. They try to go to countries where there is a more competitive market. Maybe is that kind of what you're getting at, Q?
A little bit. I mean, certain things, and we could shift the conversation out of this, like certain things that I think will be very disruptive to the cost of healthcare as a whole are telemedicine, because you will now have equally qualified doctors all over the world able to quickly give you checkups, and that will create that competitive pricing landscape that everyone is asking for, which I think is perfectly valid. I do believe that at its core, the government backstop within the healthcare industry has caused the rise in healthcare costs in this country. And the government actually does need to separate itself from this system. However, there needs to be somewhere a safeguard for the lowest denominated people, because otherwise you are making two classes of people. You are either making two classes of people that can afford healthcare and then the class of people that can't, which I thought we were against all this classist bullshit here in Bitcoin land, but I guess not. Like, I'm simply like, I don't know what the middle ground is. If I did, I wouldn't be here. I'd be running a political campaign for 2024 right now. Actually, I technically couldn't because I'm too young. But
all right, I want to shift it back to Margot, because we've been talking a lot. Like we're basically neither of us is experts. We have no idea what the fuck we're saying, and we're just talking about our ideas. Margot, what do you think is you said something in an article that you wrote for Bitcoin Magazine recently, talking about you said the only real part about Bitcoin that seems ideologically opposed to progressives at the moment is the 21 million Bitcoin cap. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I've come a long way in my analysis since when I wrote that piece, which was, I guess, almost a year ago now. I have another one in the upcoming print magazine though, so I'm excited for that. So I want to pump that, and so thank you guys. Thank you, Mark Goodwin, for asking me to write for that issue. So I really appreciate that. But yeah, so that 21 million cap is scary because they feel like, how am I going to be able to provide enough money in times of a crisis? And they also see the cap as deflationary, and they worry about debt deflation. These are the kind of comments that I hear around it. MMT, modern monetary theory, is very popular amongst progressives nowadays because when Bernie Sanders ran in 2020, Stephanie Kelton was one of his advisors, and so the squad in Congress, they're all like really excited about this, and it sounds really great. Like, yeah, we can just deficit spend our way out of all of these crises, and it'll be okay. And to some extent, fundamentally, at the most fundamental level, modern monetary theory is correct in its description of how the existing system works. And the existing monetary system works as a fiat system in the United States, right? You can effectively create money however way you want. And then, yeah, you can tax it and basically destroy it in any way you want. That's true. All of that is a true analysis. You can deficit spend. You can have a high debt to GDP ratio, and so long as somebody is holding those treasury bonds, you're going to be fine. That was an observation that Michael Hudson made when he wrote Super Imperialism, right? And that's basically how we funded a lot of wars. And also domestic spending as well, because like if you're not going to tax people, you've got to deficit spend in that way where you're not really bringing down the debt. Okay, so So effectively, like, these are very obvious descriptions. So for them, like, oh, I can't just create money because the money is 21 million and that's it. So this is going to go against how I understand economics to work and how I know how to fund public spending. So that is a problem from a, I guess, progressive economic perspective and the modern monetary theory perspective. But on the other hand, you can actually create colored Bitcoin. You can actually have Chaumian mints, right? You can do these additional things with Bitcoin. You can create IOUs, you can create like a Chaumian bank, and you could effectively print money off of the Bitcoin network. But with the caveat that you still have to hold a certain amount of Bitcoin in reserve, which then really shows the value and the goodness of that currency that you've created on the network itself. And I think that this is a really good compromise for governments that want to use Bitcoin as a reserve, because it means that you still have to maintain a certain quality of goodness in your currency, and it is verifiable on the public ledger because it's a colored Bitcoin or whatever, to a certain degree, whatever amount of Bitcoin you put into that bank to create those IOUs, right? It is known, or it should be known. And in that case, you now have a check that you didn't have before on that currency. So I think that if Bitcoin were to become an actual standard, that you wouldn't necessarily see countries use Bitcoin strictly as the de facto currency. I think that you would actually see situations where there was currency that was tied to the network, where you could then measure, you would then have accountability in a way that you didn't have accountability for that currency before. So in that sense, you can have a compromise if that's really what you want to do, and I can see that as a possibility. On the other hand, there are also other ways in which you can manage, I think, in a scenario where you're having like a financial crisis or a natural disaster, using Bitcoin itself. So I think it's just a lack of imagination too around having a currency like this. And the issue about the debt deflation stuff, honestly, that has more to do with really bad application of modern monetary theory, because the other thing is that progressives who promote modern monetary theory are not often willing to accept that modern monetary theory already happens. It's just that it's modern monetary theory for the financial sector. And the best example of that is quantitative easing, which led to asset inflation. And that is a form of monetary theory, but it's not modern monetary theory for the people or for productive economic uses. It was for financialized uses, and that caused us a lot of problems. And now we've got like this massive private debt, and the fear of debt deflation is very real as a result. So if you strip that away, then under a Bitcoin scenario, I think debt deflation would be less concerning. So I think it's really just a lack of understanding, a lack of creative thought, and thinking deeply about how would I really live under a 21 million Bitcoin cap? How would a society really function under that? What are the innovative ways in which we could build societies around that? And I really like the idea of complementary currencies being built off of the Bitcoin network, in which like local communities can have these complementary currencies, in which it allows them to keep a certain amount of wealth cycling through their own communities, and to keep that wealth within their community so that they can fund their own public works or whatever, you know. So I think that these are all like really interesting creative ideas that people and progressives in general have not really thought about as like, how do you practically implement this? So those are the stuff that I have been thinking a lot about since I wrote that piece. And I think that there are a lot of ways in which you can make this work and fit within your own political view. And I definitely ascribe to, um, oh man, oh, oh, eh, oh my gosh. Okay. Names sometimes escape me, but
I'm
he's a
terrible with
very
names
cool.
as well.
Starts with a name. It starts with an A.
Alex, Aaron,
And he's an old OG
Ephistines.
Bitcoiner, and oh my
Oh,
goodness.
Andreas Antonopoulos.
Yes, Andreas Antonopoulos. I subscribe to Andreas Antonopoulos. Sorry, Andreas Antonopoulos' idea that Bitcoin is basically apolitical. It's also economical in the sense that it can fit in any economic system. I really think that it can, or like at least most economic systems. I don't think that. I don't think that it is one particular system that it can work with. I think he's right that you can find many ways to use Bitcoin for the way that you view your society, in the way that you view that your society and your economic system should be.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask a couple more questions just about sort of what your thoughts are around why you might actually to as Diogenes the Great kind of in a similar direction, like why you might need a complementary currency. But more than that, I agree with you that if we acknowledge that Bitcoin is a system that where the incentives for the base layer technology align, then I think that people can attempt to do whatever they want to try to do with, building things on top of Bitcoin. And I think that the incentives will hopefully drive the situation towards the ideal outcome, whatever that may be. Now, you and I may have different beliefs on what that would be, but I think you're absolutely right that we should be, I think, supporting the development of multiple possibilities, and whichever one is the most successful will win out.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to answer this question?
Yes, please.
Okay,
That wasn't a
so.
question, that was a statement, but yes, go ahead.
Oh no. Oh, sorry. No, I mean, like, you have a question up here, Diogenes.
Oh, yeah, I didn't pull it up. Sorry, I was acknowledging that the thing that I just said was not a question, even though I framed it as one. I would love for you to answer the question that was just pulled up, but yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so why would anyone want to use a complementary currency if they can use a perfected currency? Why would someone choose a derivative thing when you can have a better thing? Well, so I had an interesting conversation about this with Ben Ark. Maybe you guys know Ben. He's big.
He's amazing.
Ellen Bits, and he's a pretty cool guy. And Ben had this idea that people really like their own identity, their cultural identity, and they may just prefer to have their own currency that they identify with within their own cultural identity. And I'm hope that I'm paraphrasing, getting the gist of what Ben had told me, because I had never thought about this, that people would want that. So maybe that's one possibility. But also in the studies of complementary currencies, in terms of people wanting to have money staying within a certain community, you can do that a little bit easier if you have a currency that only works within that community setting, in which you could then convert out to Bitcoin at a given time. But you could have various structures around how you would do that. And I've written a little bit about that on Medium, about complementary currencies and Bitcoin. And in terms of, like, if you really want to have a more decentralized way of society, where you don't have big nation states, you have like cities, or which are maybe the highest form of governance. In those situations, you you may want to have your own currency. It just makes sense in terms of the economics for that particular community to have that money stay local, to keep that money local. So like if I go like there, for example, there's a town in Germany that has their own complementary currency, which I wrote about. And that the idea is like if I go to this town and I have to use the specific currency, if I leave and I still have leftover currency of their own currency, I can't spend that anywhere else until I come back to that city. So in that way, it incentivizes you to come back and pay for things, buy things in their local economy. So it encourages you to support that local economy. So you've kind of put some money into a specific economy, and you've committed to a certain degree to keep that money in that economy. So for small communities, or not even necessarily small communities, but for the decentralized community scale development of independence, this could be really beneficial in that regard. But then at the same time, you can then convert back to Bitcoin, and you can do whatever, like at the international level or between cities or between states, whatever. You can still have that commerce, but in some situations, it just makes a lot of sense to have something like that. And if you're going to have that, it might as well be backed by the Bitcoin network, and by the trustlessness, the permissionlessness of it, the censorship resistance of it, but also the security of that public ledger. So you want to encourage people to do it on Bitcoin, because it's very likely that they're going to do it anyway. So let's have them tie it to the best monetary network that exists, right? So that they do it right. We don't want them to just create another fiat currency that is worthless. You want it to tie it to a certain amount of Bitcoin that guarantees that you're not going to just print however you want with no accountability. So yeah, complementary currencies.
I think there's also a very likely scenario, because I love this idea. This is something that I talk about a lot, and then literally people at Bitcoin Magazine tell me to shut the fuck up, that I'm an idiot and I'm not a Bitcoin maxi enough. CK Snark, I'm talking about you, literally you. I think we will see in the same way, like I described in the chats, you have states like California that take one stance, and then you have a state like Texas that takes a completely different. You're going to have countries that they'll have Bitcoin and gold or maybe something else backing their then fiat currency built on top. And then you'll have other jurisdictions and countries that will just say, no, we're not even going to worry about the money. Like Bitcoin is the money, and just transact as you see fit. We're going to deal with other things here. And it will become a competitive landscape yet again, where certain jurisdictions will handle it appropriately and others will not. And then you will see people move to said jurisdictions. But because I have a magic 8 ball and I know exactly how the future is going to play out, and that is exactly how it's going to play out, I'm going to leave the show now and go over to Vegas. But I kid. This is just the scenario in my head that I play out. But there are. Go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that this is sort of that. This is the ideal in it, and I think it's an ideal that works well for both the left and the right, if we are really going to use these terms, because David Wengrow and David Graeber wrote a book recently called The Dawn of Everything. And one of the main points that they pointed out that they found in the anthropological and archaeological studies of societies is that people should have the right to move wherever they want and be welcomed wherever they go, right? And I think that this is also a libertarian value in terms of the Mises Hayek libertarianism. This idea that not just capital should have the ability to go wherever it wants, but also that labor effectively should have the right to go wherever it wants. And Mises in particular was a big proponent of this early on until World War II happened. And at that point, Mises kind of gave into the state, into state nationalism, and went along with restricting the movement of certain people in the name of war. And I think Mises ultimately thought that this would be a temporary thing, but it didn't really work out that way. So being able to go wherever you want is really really essential to this whole thing, to this whole future. And also the idea that let's just let as many people and societies come up with their own way of doing things, and let's see which one does the best job, and the one that does the best job is where people should be able to go, and that's where they should be able to live and be part of that society. And that's very much a left anarchist perspective as well, and one that I absolutely ascribe to. So yeah, I think this is the ideal utopian that world that I would like.
If only the world and life could be so peaceful and easy.
Yeah.
I'm going to give the trigger warning one more time because I do want to shift the conversation now to like what I really want to talk to you about, Margot. But we're going to talk about some things that are going to piss you off. Please listen. Please feel free to throw questions in the comments. I want to talk about climate change and I want to talk about
Dun,
Bitcoin.
dun, dun.
I love nature. I see the effects of climate change. I don't care if you believe it or not, if you think it's a hoax. Yes, there's tons of data that I'm going to let Margot talk to us about because this is the expert in this field. Neither of us are, nor are you, quite honestly. But if you are, let us know. Margot, what are the conversations around climate change, not from the political aspect, but just broadly? What are the main areas of focus of climate activists today?
Yeah. So climate activists are really concerned with system change, I think, fundamentally. There's a really great protest sign that I've seen at some of the climate demonstrations is system change, not climate change. Because they fundamentally see that there is a problem with the existing system. Like so many of us do, especially in Bitcoin, we really recognize that there is a fundamental problem with the existing system and we want to change that. And that's why we're in Bitcoin, because we see changing the money itself as at least a starting point for doing that. So they really want system change. They also really want recognition that there are certain groups of people in the world that have been adversely harmed by the fossil fuel companies and really by our consumption of fossil fuels and all of the emissions that we put into the atmosphere overall, since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So the global south in particular is really being affected, and they're not the major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. So they want justice for people who are being adversely affected right now already by climate change. So a lot of the comments that I see on Twitter sometimes when I talk about climate change is like, oh, you just want to starve these people. You don't want them to have energy like we do. You want them to be in poverty, and you want to control them. That's actually the exact opposite narrative that climate activists have, and that what they're fighting for. In fact, what they want is the ability for these countries, these people, to be able to have a better standard of living, and for the really rich countries to stop being excessive, wasteful consumerists in the way that our culture has become, which is just like constant, like get new things all the time, even things that we don't necessarily want. And we're very wasteful, very, very wasteful, especially in the United States. So for climate activists, it's really they want a better world for everyone. They want justice for those who have been most harmed. But they especially want, on top of that, I mean, in combination with all of that, is to stop putting emissions, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because the more greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere, the worse our situation is going to be going forward into the future. So, stopping our emissions now means that we have a better chance of having a future that is familiar to us today. So, we're already seeing those changes now. Like, we're seeing lots of horrific flooding, like in Pakistan right now. Over 1,000 people have died. They're saying this is the worst thing they've ever seen on record. We have record droughts all across Europe. We have very, very low water levels in the Western United States. We have a horrific famine developing in the Horn of Africa. Now it's guaranteed that we're going to get about a foot of sea level rise already because of previous emissions, because of the Arctic and the melting of the ice caps. So, the idea is like we need to stop this from getting worse, because if it gets worse, we're going to a lot of people are going to suffer and they're going to die needlessly because we could have prevented this. And really all we had to do was just stop burning fossil fuels. So that's really, I think that's the climate activist perspective these days.
So I want to unpack one part of that in particular, and it's not the part that P wants to unpack. So we can unpack P's part second. But I want to go to Sri Lanka, and we saw a perfect example of ESG policies being shoved down a country that maybe couldn't afford those policies. They had one of the highest ESG ratings across the entire world, over 90% ESG rating, versus the US sitting at a paltry, I believe it was 52% rating. And it seems and reads very much like the same cycle that we have bore witness to here in this country, where once an industry starts to entrench itself and become, like, the perfect example I will use is the way the tech industry has grown and some of the policy measures that big tech is trying to get Congress to issue would almost make it impossible for a new tech conglomerate to be formed, grow, and compete with the likes of Google, Apple, Facebook, etc., Meta, etc. It feels like we're doing almost a similar playbook where it's like we're raising the standard for the rest of the world so they can't actually get to our level, and in turn they bankrupt themselves. So I'm I'm curious just your thoughts on how the situation transpired in Sri Lanka and how we can learn from that so it doesn't get replicated around the world.
Yeah, this is one of the concerning things about how governments are dealing with climate change, right? A country like Sri Lanka is not responsible for all of those emissions. It's the United States, it's China, it's the European Union, it's Japan, right? These are the countries, these wealthy nations, these are the countries that are the ones that really have the responsibility. And these top-down approaches are concerning, and sometimes I wonder if they're intentional. I mean, you can't deny that taking advantage of a crisis is a great way to consolidate power or force someone or a country to do something they otherwise wouldn't want to do. No, we're seeing this also playing out in the Netherlands with the farmers there that are pushing back around the recent requirements around emissions reductions, and and then talking about like people having a certain amount of carbon like budget and how that would work out. And a lot of that I feel like is like a Davos solution to the problem, where it allows the rich people to still be able to do whatever they want, go on their private jets, ski where in whatever exclusive area that they love to ski in, and they're not really like actual solutions that help people, that lift everybody up. So I really am worried about that. And I think also when I get comments online like on Bitcoin Twitter about climate change, I hear stuff like this, like oh, it's just a way to control people. So I think that when you see these things happening, it really harms our ability to actually solve this issue, because it just turns people away from what is really happening, and from us being able to get those real solutions, those real societal shifts, those changes that we need to stop being such a consumerist culture, to decentralize our societies much more than what they are. Like, these are all the ideas that come out of aspects of the degrowth movement, or the degrowth literature, which is also a scary term. Degrowth sounds like we're trying to kill people, but it's really not. It's like, I think a friend of mine, Scott Wolf, he calls it sustainable abundance, and which is really what I think it's about. So yeah, we have to really be careful with how states go about dealing with this, because I think, especially as the situation gets worse, and I think that it's going to get worse, especially on the socio-political scale and socio-political economic scale of things. Like, we're going to see more inflation happening. We're going to see more energy crises. We're going to see more food crisis, and we're going to see governments panic, I think. And there's a desire to centralize power, and to have more control over the situation as things destabilize. And as Bitcoiners, we're really opposed to that. So we have to be mindful that these things can happen, and we have to. I think we do have to figure out how to provide viable solutions in these situations for people, so that they can have Bitcoin as a lifeboat. But even having Bitcoin as a lifeboat won't be enough if there's no food around, right? So this is the thing that I think is not too far off from today.
I want to
Sorry to
first.
be a downer.
No, no,
No, no,
no,
no. No.
no.
There's a lot to unpack there.
I want to. So there are two parts of the question, and it's literally the second part is the opposite of the first part of the question. So these types of issues that we see give fuel to the fire for the anti-climate change narrative. And in the way our society is just, we see everything as black and white. We see everything as you're either on this side or on that side. There's no in between. And there is, unfortunately, a spectrum of this where there's room for climate activists to maybe be wrong about certain things. And there is room for people who don't believe in what is going on before their very eyes to also be wrong about certain things. I want to ask you, in all honesty, like, what do you think climate activists are getting wrong that is giving a little bit more fuel to the anti-climate change narrative?
That's a good question. Obviously, they're getting Bitcoin wrong. That's a big one. That's a big one. I think one of the things that people are getting wrong too is the belief that we live in a world where governments are willing to cooperate with each other. And that is not the world that we live in. And the IPCC has various social pathway models, and they basically say, like, given these societal, economic, political scenarios, what is the likelihood of maintaining emissions below a certain level, or maintaining, global temperature below a certain level, like 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C of warming. And the most commonly talked about scenarios, imagine a very cooperative world where governments are working together, and they're reducing emissions together, and they're doing this all, and it's a very friendly plan, right? And it's a very cohesive human world society that we're living in, very peaceful. And this is not really what's happening at all today. We're actually seeing a lot of instability, political instability. We're seeing inflation, and inflation drives socioeconomic instability. Inflation was a big part, my understanding, inflation was a big part of the Arab the Arab Spring, right? That food prices were so high. And when people can't get food or water, they're going to get upset, right? And inflation is a big part of this. So since we're starting to see that, we're starting to see crop failures, we're starting to see issues around the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, you know, all of this instability, political instability, this push towards centralization, authoritarianism, all of that is really putting us in a different social pathway. So we have to recognize that, and we have to start thinking of solutions that can work within that particular pathway. And we are not, climate activists, I don't think, are ready to accept that, or if they have just given up, and they are what we call doomers, you know. And it's like we just have to start thinking that we don't have to rely on government to solve these problems, because if we think that the government is going to solve all these problems, we're going to end up with most of these problems unsolved, because there's so much gridlock, especially in the United States. So and there's so much divisiveness as well, and people are turned against each other because of the corporate media like CNN and other channels like that are now like they pit each other against everybody against each other, and you're my enemy because you voted for this person without understanding why those people voted for that person, you know. So we have to find ways outside of the system, outside of our political system, to make these things happen, because it's just too dysfunctional, I think. I want to be wrong. Let me tell you, I hope that I'm wrong. And if I turn out to be wrong, I'll be very happy, because it's much harder in a way to do it this way. So that, I think, is what climate activists are getting wrong. And this is also why Bitcoin is really helpful, and why I have decided to put so much effort into creating this narrative around Bitcoin and trying to show people that Bitcoin can work within your own socioeconomic political views. And it's not only for the Mises Hayek libertarians, you know, it is for anyone. And it's because I think that Bitcoin allows us to create circular economies, and if we can create these circular economies, and we can take the philosophy, the inherent philosophy that comes out of Bitcoin, which is like the low time preference, this reversal of incentives, then we can find ways outside of the existing system to make these changes at a fundamental level, which is what we're seeing now. Like with methane mining is a really great example, where it turns out that actually this is a great way to buy ourselves time to reduce our methane emissions, which are responsible for like 0.5 of the existing warming that has already happened. We collect that, pump it through a combustion engine, out comes carbon dioxide and water. And now, instead of methane, we're releasing carbon dioxide. Yes, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but over 20 years, methane is 84 times greater in its warming effect. Over 100 years, it's about 24 times, 27 times greater. And then ultimately, that amount of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere is actually a lot less than the total impact of CO2. So I was just reading an academic paper on this about atmospheric methane, and it sounds like actually, even though we would be releasing carbon emissions from it, it's not enough to make a serious impact, which is really great. So we can really do good. And we're doing this using the good incentives, good Bitcoin incentives in the market. And here's a way to actually do something good within the market in a way that, you know, even your progressives are really cynical that you can do anything good through the market. So here's a way to do that outside of the government, and to correctly incentivize taking care of the planet, right? So this is what I mean. Like, we have to reach people. We have to show them that there is a potential here for us to solve some really big problems using Bitcoin, and hopefully getting that as a step towards further adoption of Bitcoin, and seeing that actually having a monetary network that is permissionless, that is censorship resistant, that has a protocol that is very, very difficult to change, that can really change the way people view the world, I think. And I don't know about you guys, but when I really started thinking really seriously about Bitcoin, it opened up a world of possibilities for me that I felt were completely lost in the existing system. And so I really would love to see so many people be able to have that, light bulb moment where they're like, wow, yeah, maybe we can change things. Maybe we really could do things, and we can do it at the local scale. And we don't need to try to like go to Congress and do this at the top, from the top down. We can do this. We can still have the things that we want, and we can do it ourselves. We can empower ourselves. So that's a long distance from what climate activists get wrong, but that's how I hope that we can fix what they get wrong.
No, totally. I do Diagenesis the Great. I see your question, and I do want to ask it. I want to go first though, dive deeper onto the Bitcoin of it all while we're there. We see the attacks from the left, and I'm just going to label it the left broadly. We have arguably literally the dumbest banking goon out there, Elizabeth Warren, continuing this like bullshit FUD around Bitcoin is bad, energy use is bad. I want to just give you the opportunity to speak directly to Elizabeth Warren, and
Listener of the show.
a longtime listener.
Yes.
Say exactly what you hope to say to her to.
Oh my gosh.
I hate to say change her mind, but like
that is a big ask, Q. That's like
Margot. I'm sorry, but like it's on you. You got to change Elizabeth Warren's mind.
God.
The fate of Bitcoin rests in your hands.
No, I'm not ready for this. Yeah, Elizabeth Warren really doesn't understand Bitcoin. That's for sure. I find it really ironic that Elizabeth Warren used to be a champion of the people against the banking system, against Wells Fargo, against Chase, against HSBC, against all of these companies that took advantage of people during the financial crisis. And she used to be an advocate. And in fact, I've heard her even over the pandemic, she was really critical of the amount of banking fees that were being put on people during the pandemic. And she was right. Why are you charging people all these fees just to hold their money in in your bank account when they again have no choice but to put it in your bank account, right? It's another one of those oligopoly situations where you don't have the freedom of choice in terms of banking. So I would challenge her to think like, what really is the solution that you want? How do you really want to solve this problem? Because there is an existing solution. It's called Bitcoin. And it's one where people can actually exit the existing banking system, take custody of their own money, and not worry about fees, not worried about banks taking advantage of them, because it's their money and they're managing it themselves, or they're managing it in their community, right? Like we want community banks. You can have a community bank with Bitcoin. You have Galloway Wallet, for example. That's a community bank. So, these are the solutions that I thought Elizabeth Warren wanted. It seems that she doesn't want to really help people. I would like to know why. And if she's concerned about the environmental impact, then I think we can have a really great conversation about that. And I'm pretty certain that I could persuade her on her on that fairly easily, because I've been working very hard on another progressive on that, and have had some pretty good success these days with them. And ultimately, Bitcoin is a lifeboat. And what's wrong with people having a lifeboat?
So I think that's beautifully put. I do believe that you are our best and last hope to convince the devil that is Elizabeth Warren. So no pressure, but I wish you the best of luck to prepare you. I
might have better chance with AOC.
We honestly might. and I do think it will be one of these younger progressive political figures that will come out pro Bitcoin, understanding what it affords to the unbanked population. And that will be a very quick narrative shift for many left leaning and left affiliated citizens of this country. I do want to go back though to Diogenes' question and about sun cycles, but I want to expand that because historically speaking, there is data that shows that we have actually gone through these periods of shifting our climate. We've gone through ice ages. We've seen the Sahara Desert was previously an ocean. We've seen Earth very naturally make these shifts. Why is that? Why are these points very rarely brought up in these research papers? Why is it very rarely discussed by climate activists? I'll just leave it at that.
So climate has natural variability. This is absolutely correct. And the climate is definitely a nonlinear dynamical system. So there are a lot of intertemporal variations that happen, shifts in terms of sea surface temperatures that happen. We're probably most familiar with the El Nino La Nina cycle, which happens like over a decade cycle, right? This is all natural variability that happens because of the tilt of the earth and the spinning of the earth, and that shapes how pressures change, how temperatures change, and also the fact that we have life on this planet. So we have these carbon cycles, we have water cycles. So we have a lot of this natural variability that happens. And yes, this can cause ice ages. It can cause not, times where you're not in an ice age, I guess. And yeah, all of that is very true. I think it's generally not discussed because it's already been ruled out by climate scientists. And climate science goes back a very, very long time. And this question about whether we're putting CO2 emissions into the atmosphere goes back really to the start of the industrial age, when scientists were really starting to think about what happens when you increase CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's really just, I think it's a fairly simple calculation to do, because you just have to understand that at the atomic scale, you have bonds that are vibrating. And when light hits those bonds, it's absorbed and reflected back in a certain way. And it can be reflected back at a certain wavelength, and that particular wavelength can give off heat. And there are certain molecules that are better at doing that than others. And some of those are actually water, carbon dioxide, methane, among a few others that are what we call greenhouse gases. So even going that far back, it was obvious to scientists that this could be a problem in 100 years. So climate scientists that have been studying the atmosphere had a pretty good sense of how that works. It's a lot of physics. It's very complicated to explain the equations that go along with this, and the variability. And there's these waves that also change how these cycles work in terms of like the El Nino and La Nina, right? So when they started getting more serious about it, I think it was just pretty straightforward to isolate that if you increase carbon dioxide, and it's just very simple, because you have a very basic combustion equation, which is you take any hydrocarbon and you combust it, you're going to get CO2 and water vapor. And both of these are actually greenhouse gases. So you're going to put more CO2. So that's just basic chemistry, very basic to understand. So I think really it's just for the researchers who were doing this, it was easy to say, like, well, let's look at the variability and what we understand about variability, and then let's look at what happens when we keep increasing CO2 under these existing conditions. And it just became obvious that it was not plausible that natural variability or sun cycles were the cause of the change in climate that we're seeing now. And also just the accelerated rate compared to the historical record. And we can go pretty far back because we use ice cores to do that. So the ice cores can tell us a lot about the atmosphere at the time. As you go deeper down, you can learn a lot about the composition of the atmosphere at that time and how far back, whatever time that was, right? Whatever the paleoclimate was. So there's a whole area study around that. And actually, to the people that are critical of the modeling, James Hansen in particular thinks that we should be relying way more on the paleoclimate record, which is the empirical evidence, to then make an assessment of what we can expect future climate to be. So it is not that there isn't an internal critique around the modeling either, although the modeling overall has been fairly accurate, if anything, conservative in its findings, which is to say, like, climate scientists are consistently surprised that things are happening much faster than they anticipated or worse than they anticipated. So yeah, I think it's just not really talked about just because I think that's already been settled. But I think there was, I don't remember his first name, his last name is Dessler. He was on Peter McCormick's show, What Bitcoin Did, about a month ago, and he went through a lot of this stuff on his show. So I do recommend that episode if you want to hear it in more detail, because I think he actually had slides on the video recording of it. So it'd probably be really helpful to see those slides.
So I definitely do not pretend to be a climate expert or to be able to offer meaningful commentary or thoughts on the things you've just said. But one thing that I'm curious about is whether or not one agrees with the frame that you just put forward. What do we do from here? Like, I think that there are a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of conflation between the idea of like being pro environment and being sort of what I would, cast a wide net and say like anti energy. And so I think that it's important that we distinguish between those two things. So do you feel like would your argument be that we are using too much energy, or that we should be using more efficient energy? Like, how would you, and kind of what I'm really kind of zeroing in on is like people that make the claim that like Bitcoin is using too much energy.
Yeah, well, that's an easier one to answer first. But obviously, Bitcoin is not using too much energy. It uses about like 0.5% of the global electricity consumption, and it uses about 0.06, so like about half of 0.1% of global energy consumption, right? So not all of our energy use is electricity. So it's really not. It's really, as Lynn Alden says, around error in that regard. So in terms of, are we using too much? I think the right question is, what are we using that energy for? Are we very wasteful with our energy? And I think we are in a lot of ways in terms of consumerism, and also propping up the financial sector, I think, is very wasteful. I think the fact that we throw a lot of stuff away is a wasteful use of energy, because you had to use energy to create that stuff. Like, we get a lot of stuff that's very cheaply made, and it doesn't last very long. And our society didn't used to be like that. And if we were able to build products that lasted much longer, or we found ways to not accumulate a whole bunch of stuff for no reason, I think that we really wouldn't have to ask whether we're using too much energy. And then the thing is, like, when people say we're using too much energy, they're really talking about the West. And I don't think that they really go enough detail or nuanced discussion around it. And I actually think it's because people don't even really think about it. I think they really just believe we're using too much energy. We just got to reduce our energy consumption, and they don't really give any thought to how that energy is produced,
100%.
how the energy is even delivered to you. Right? It's people are really clueless. They turn on a light switch in their house and they get power. They have no idea how it got there. They don't know that how much of that energy was wasted before it got to you, especially if you're using renewable energy, right? There's a lot that gets wasted. So I don't really think in general that we're using too much energy, but I do think that it would really be beneficial if we stopped using energy for wasteful means.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that and I think we only have about 3 minutes left, but one of the things that we haven't really had time to go into is to kind of separate out the pro-environmental arguments. I think certainly for myself, a lot of the arguments that are made by people who are, let's say, instead of saying anti-Bitcoin, let's say like pre-Bitcoin. I think that the arguments that people on that side or in that group make often kind of get unreasonably kind of twisted up with like quote unquote environmental issues and concerns. And I think it's important to disambiguate those things and to really separate out the things that are where those things are kind of, or where one thing is being co-opted in service of kind of an anti-Bitcoin narrative.
Yeah, this energy conservation idea has been around for a long time. I mean, I don't like to leave light switches on or needlessly because it is wasteful, but it also costs money, right? So I just want to turn that switch off. I hate when people leave all their lights on. Like, what are you doing? You're paying for that. Stop.
Dude, I got into it with my girlfriend over the weekend where I was like, we're about to move in together. And I hate that you just like leave lights on everywhere because like that's an electricity. Like I don't even care about the consumption side of it, as terrible as it sounds to frame it like that. I just care like you made my electricity bill go up. Don't do that.
But I think that's what it comes down to, right? I think being able to say like, "Hey, you cost me more money," like let's try to save money as a family is a reasonable distinction. But I think that there's so much, as in so many things, there's this moralization issue to it that I have an issue with, because I think, to your point, Margot, it's I think people should be able to, if they're purchasing energy, they should be able to do what they want with that energy within reasonable means. But I think that there is this massive kind of narrativization of energy usage. And so many people who argue, in support of like turning off light switches, for example, still are more than happy to use, a clothes dryer, every day or every other day. And I think that there's just this huge disconnect between environmentalism, quote unquote, and the actions that people actually take. And then it gets wrapped up in this moralization and it just becomes this like sticky morass that is super counterproductive.
Absolutely. There's a lot of contradictions and hypocrisy in these arguments, and they don't really pan out. And I think that is a certain amount of privilege in that, and also just like taking things for granted. That the things that you have, you're taking them for granted. That you have a washer and dryer, you have no idea how much energy it uses. You don't think about how much energy your air conditioner or your heater uses, right? Like they use those. These are very energy intensive systems that you have in your house, and nobody questions whether or not they should have an air conditioner or whether or not they should have a washer and dryer. I mean, nowadays, like, unfortunately, with global warming, it's getting hotter on average, right? The summers are getting hotter. We're getting lots more heat waves. People are really, really depend on these ACs. And that means that the hotter the planet gets, the more people are going to need air conditioning, the more energy consumption that's going to happen, right? So the people who are criticizing Bitcoin are not really thinking about all of these things. And okay, so let's say air conditioning is a fundamental right for that reason, that if it gets too hot, you're going to die. But a washer and dryer is not really a fundamental right. You can wash your clothes and hang them out to dry, and by some arguments, it's probably better to dry them on the line because the sun has natural antibacterial properties. And honestly, I
And your
just bought
clothes
some new,
last longer as well.
and you're, yes, I was
Don't
just gonna get to
shrink.
that.
Yeah.
Just gonna get to it because I just ordered some new clothes, and I was looking at the directions because these are made out of linen, and they're like, don't put this in the dryer if you want this to last longer. They were even saying like just hand wash them. I was like, wow, yeah, this explains. And then I started folding my clothes, and I'm like, this explains why my clothes are getting ugly. Why my clothes always get ugly? It's because the washer and then the dryer, that heat, it's just so bad for your
It's terrible for the
clothes,
clothes. Yeah.
and it's just
And it wears
destroying
them
your
out.
clothes. So then
But
I was
people,
thinking like,
yeah, go
yeah, I
ahead.
was like,
I'm
maybe
getting
I should be
excited. I'm
hanging
sorry.
my,
Go ahead.
maybe I should be hanging my clothes. But then it's like the social, like, oh, this is bad. You know, you're hanging your clothes, you're poor or something. Like it looks ugly because, and I'm gonna say a story about this that is about Elvis Presley's mother, Gladys Presley. They grew up very poor. They were sharecroppers. When Elvis made it big, he bought Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee. And she was still hanging her clothes on the clothesline and drying it. And the neighbors complained. They're like, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be using a washer and dryer. She was looked down upon for drying her clothes on the line. So now that's like it's a stigma, but it turns out it's actually better for your clothes and it's probably better for your health to be drying them outside. But P, you were gonna say something.
No, I was just going to say that I'm just fascinated with the cognitive dissonance between people, again, going back to the energy thing. Again, I think you should be able to, if you're paying for your energy, you should be able to decide how you want to use it. But it just drives me crazy when people are like, oh, Bitcoin mining as a boogeyman is bad and it uses too much energy. And then meanwhile, they're like, but I need my Christmas lights, I need my clothes dryer, I need my clothes washer. And
Yeah, exactly.
people
Oh my
just don't
gosh,
take
Christmas lights.
intellectual responsibility for like their arguments. But
Yeah,
unfortunately,
it's just the
Wait,
ignorance. It's just ignorance. They have no idea. They
I
think
want to
only
ask one more
Bitcoin
question,
uses energy. Yeah.
if I can, if we want to stay a little longer, because I know P and I have another meeting, and Margo, I don't
I'm
know
getting
if you have.
hungry.
Okay, okay. Solar panels. Are
Solar
we
panels.
pro or against, given where we have to source all the materials to actually make these solar panels for?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we pretty much source everything from China. So we're really screwed no matter what. We basically, we made, I mean, not us, but our government and and
AFP.
corporations, they made a decision to export our manufacturing overseas because it was cheaper at the time. And that means that all of our production happens overseas now. So if we want to produce solar panels in the United States, it's going to take a very long time to get that production going and to get it competitive because ultimately companies are going to want to price it, want the cheapest thing, the cheapest product, right? So this is a long way of saying that I feel that we have to find ways to improve those working conditions all around for all aspects, like the production of our clothes, the production of our plates, our refrigerators, our computers, our solar panels, everything. Everything is created. Our shoes, they're produced by people, by a lot of times by slave labor and children, and it's horrible. I did see one company that this solar panel company that said that they are working very hard on making sure that these things like the labor side, how they're produced is both so that they're recyclable or reusable and that they're being manufactured under better labor conditions. So I did see one company that said that that's something that they're really working on because I think it's clear that they're feeling the pressure. So it's really good for people to put pressure on the companies and say like, I don't want my solar panels to be built by people who are forced into indentured servitude to create these, right? But if you go down the production for even batteries that you put into your calculator or your remote control, it's also really ugly too. when I was in middle school, I stopped wearing Nikes because I heard that children were being paid a dime to make Nikes, and I was like, screw that! I'm never wearing Nikes again. So these are these are just this is just a function of our existing economic system, unfortunately, and it's just horrible because it's a type of colonialism too. But also China benefits, right? China benefits from their cheap labor, and as they lift people out of poverty, they need to find other people to work for cheap so that they can maintain their industrial capitalist system, which it is. It is it is an industrial capitalism to a certain degree. It's very centralized. The state controls it for the most part, but it is still industrial capitalism, and they need cheap labor. So they've got plenty of people to pull from still in that regard, but they're so long as they keep bringing up their population in terms of income and wealth, they're not going to want to work for cheap in manufacturing factories, and that would mean that their products will cost more. So they want to stay competitive, they are going to have to take on these really bad practices.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's like a whole massive system change that is needed, that we're not addressing, that needs more conversation, needs more action, and it's very hard to change unless there's a fundamental shift. It's going to take a lot of work.
Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of the show. I want to thank you for coming on. I definitely, I appreciate you being willing to engage with us on it. As I said, there's a lot of stuff that we talked about that that I have very different views on, but I think being able to have these kinds of dialogues and to find the things that we all kind of can like anchor to around Bitcoin, it's super important because it's the only way that we can learn as a community and go forward. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think that we agree more on things than we realize too. So
yeah.
I
muted myself accidentally, but yeah, I completely agree.
Awesome.
Well,
Margot, where can everyone stay up to date with the work you're doing? We know you have your next article coming out in the Bitcoin Magazine print edition, which you can get a subscription to at the Bitcoin Magazine store. But where else is your next work? Where can people stay up to date with your work?
Yeah, so I've been writing a lot on Medium. There's a link in my Twitter profile, a Linktree link, and you can get to those articles from there. I also write, obviously, for the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I have some policy papers there already, so you can read those there as well. And I'm on Twitter as, obviously, Jen Urso. That's my name on Twitter. That's pretty much where you can find me, talk to me, yell at me. I get a lot of that. So yeah. And also Bitcoin Magazine, obviously, as you said.
Of course. Well, thank you again. And reminder to everyone, if you have not already gotten your Bitcoin Amsterdam tickets, you can get those. Use code BMLive. You'll save 10%. There's also the censorship-resistant issue of the magazine, which is a fantastic read. We'll be back tomorrow with more of all of this. We'll see you then. Thanks so much.
Thank you.